Good morning, everybody. Um, Today we are super happy to welcome David Haskell. And I got to know about David's work. I think right before COVID, I started reading The Forest Unseen, which was given to me by my aunt. And it's all about observing this 1 square meter of forest day after day after day and noting what happened. And I have to say that book personally was um, a great resource for how to enjoy my local environment during the pandemic, where I was pretty much cloistered in one place. But that book taught me how to keep my curiosity on what was familiar and near, and try to recognize individuals and all that. So super happy that not only he wrote this book, but he recently wrote a book all about sound, including the sonic history of our planet, the importance of cilia, and um, I don't know, many more incredible things that he's going to explain much better than I can. So, um, yeah, and also I think David will talk to us about how to write about sound. So many of our words, our descriptions are I feel like they're slanted towards the visual, and so I'm really curious to hear more about his approach towards writing about sounds. And so with that, I think David will take the floor, and we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So yeah, thanks so much for being with us today, David.
Right. Thank you, Ben. It's such a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted that the Forest Unseen was helpful in that way. One of my hopes for all of my books is to offer an invitation to people to engage with the sensory world of biodiversity and ecological processes in their home place. Like, we don't necessarily need to go to some exotic hallowed locale to find wonder, although of course traveling and discovering new things is can be a marvelous way of getting to the world, know the world as well. But often we tend to neglect the wonders right on our doorsteps. And so my books are, I hope, offer that invitation to people. And it's a delight to be with you here, particularly since this is sort of focusing on sound, and the people on the call here all know sound often much better than I do. So I'm happy to receive corrections and advice for other directions, other ways to think about things. And very grateful that Cornell is hosting this. I was a grad student at Cornell back in the 1990s in ecology and evolution, and spent a lot of time at the old lab of ornithology building out on Sapsucker Woods in the bioacoustics lab there, that at that time was led by Chris Clark. I believe Russ Sharif is on the call here. He was a great help. And I spent a lot of time in one of the back rooms measuring spectrograms in Canary, one of the earlier versions of visualization and quantification software, before a lot of stuff got automated. So just literally going through hours and hours and taking individual measurements from spectrograms, studying the evolution of begging calls in wood warblers. So it's a delight to be back virtually in that environment. So I'm going to talk about this book, Sounds Wild and Broken. My camera is not working on it so well. So this is a book that came out about 3 years ago now. It's out in paperback. There's a Penguin paperback now. There are translations in French, Italian, Korean, Chinese. I don't think there's a Spanish translation yet. We're still working on that. But my other books, The Forest Unseen and The Songs of Trees, are out in a number of Asian languages, but also European languages. So, and that's, of course, a great pleasure for me to know that the words are reaching out beyond the confines of the English language. And if any of you use any of that material, or I've also done op-eds on sound for the New York Times. Emergence Magazine has several of my narrated audio essays with sound design in them that are free online. If any of you use that, in your classes or assign these books, I'm very happy to zoom in for like a 30-minute Q&A or questions with students. I really love doing that. And you know, I'm a teacher mostly by trade. And so anyway, the invitation is out there if you want me to come into your class remotely. I'm happy to do that if we can find the right time and so on. So I'm going to share a few of the ideas and approaches from the book, hopefully give you a few thoughts about writing about sound, connecting with non-specialists. I want to start a little bit though with briefly with my own story as a quote unquote writer, in that I didn't learn to read until I was quite like 7 years old. So I was sort of very late on that. I was in remedial English classes for a lot of my education. And so I was put in this box early on of like, here's a guy who can't read, he can't write very well, and so on. And now, you know, I'm writing books and they've won awards and things. And so I guess my encouragement, and I say this a lot when I'm working with undergrads, is that the world tends to label us with things that we're good at, bad at. And academia is very good at that, sort of narrowing us down into little boxes. I'd encourage you to be skeptical about that and not to internalize them too much. And if you find yourself drawn to a particular creative outlet that works well with your science and other things, whether it's writing or visual art or music, even if you believe that you're no good at it, I would say just go for it and try it. You know, be experimental, and don't believe the things that often early life sets boundaries around us that I think it's helpful to push at later in life. And that was certainly true for me as a writer. And the way I mostly learned to write and to write quote unquote well is by reading the works of other people and getting pleasure from that. And I, you know, still read a lot, and that feeds my writing practice. So my training is as a biologist. I have a degree in zoology and then in ecology and evolution later. And I've taught. I right now work at a liberal arts college, and I've worked here for 29 years. So I've been teaching mostly undergraduates for a long time, but mostly about science, biological science, environmental science. And then about 15 years ago, I had this very strong sense that I wanted to expand that communication about the wonders of biology and of ecological ways of thinking about things and engaging with biodiversity with a wider audience beyond the students who are there in my classes. And writing was one way of doing that. Because I think these stories are, of course, important for a world that is in crisis. We've got a biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, but also their value in and of themselves. Even if we weren't in a time of crisis, knowing the stories of how our kin and neighbors, the non-human beings in this world came to be, I think is really important and has value to teach us who we are and who we might be in relation to others. And so my other goal, other than sort of telling these stories to a wider audience, was to bring science and ethics in particular, like how we should live, which is not a scientific question, it's an ethical question, in conversation with science, and do that in a way that's about sort of creative writing, the outside of the usual academic mold of writing scientific papers and technical reports, which are an art form, all of their. I mean, there's a beauty in writing or producing a really amazing graph, or writing the methods or results section so it's just no extraneous material. That is an act of extreme creativity in and of itself. Writing a book, of course, draws on other forms of creativity, like using metaphors and good verbs and things that you can't really do so much in the technical papers. And I think in our world of fragmentation, where often disciplines are divided from one another, you know, we've got art over here, science here, writing it somewhere else. Our world is fragmented and getting broken up, sort of in a literal ecological sense. Part of that defragmentation has to be a defragmentation, I think, of academia itself and how we think about things. So in my own very small way, I'm trying to do a little part of that work. Obviously, we all find our own ways of doing that. So the book's basic arc, if you like, is to start kind of at the beginning of the story of planet Earth, when there weren't any living beings making sounds, or there were just bacteria making little vibratory, as far as we know, non-communicative sounds in very viscous medium around them, through the evolution of animal communicative sounds, and then thinking about where human music and language fits into that wider diversity of animal sounds, how everything got to be so diverse, and then talking about acoustic crises, the crisis of inattention, like we're not listening anymore, mostly culturally, the crisis of too much noise in some places, and then paradoxically, too little sound in others, the silencing of many ecosystems. And then wrapping it up with some more general thoughts about where sound came from before planet Earth even existed, and where sound is going in very long-term future. So throughout the book, I zip between timescales from the whole arc of Earth's history down to much smaller timescales and back out. And that's part of the excitement of writing in this way, is you get to change the camera angle, change the scene, the time frame, bit by bit. So what I'm going to do now is go through some of the themes in the book. I'm not going to try and cover all the different things I discuss in the book, and give you some particularities about how I chose to write about things and explain them. And hopefully you can get some good ideas about your own writing. And it could be writing, or it could be giving public talks, or other forms of quote unquote science communication, which is a term I don't really like, because like if you talk to a musician, they don't think of themselves as note communicators. So what we should be doing is riffing with science and inventing and combining, not just saying science is here and we're going to communicate it outwards. No, let's take the science and interweave with other things, including our own personal experience. So I'm going to read from just 3 or 4 chapters here for a couple of minutes, just to give you a taste. And we're jumping in on page, I don't know, 10 in the book, trying to reframe the experience of hearing and putting it in an evolutionary context. So the chapter is called Unity and Diversity. In the moment of our birth, we are dragged across 400 million years of evolutionary time. We turn from aquatic creatures to dwellers of air and land. We gasp, sucking the alien gas into our lungs previously filled with warm, salty ocean. Our eyes are pulled from the dim reddish glow of the deep into jabbing brightness. The chill of evaporation slaps our drying skin. No wonder we wail. No wonder we forget, burying the memory in the soil of the subconscious. Our earliest and only experience of sound before birth was the hum and throb of an aquatic cocoon. Our mother's voice found us, as did the sounds of her surging blood, breath flowing in lungs, churning digestion. Fainter were the sounds of the world beyond our mother, from places then unimaginable to our mostly unformed brains. High tones were attenuated by the enclosing walls of flesh and fluid, and so our first sonic experiences were low and often rhythmic as her body pulsed and moved. All of this gone in an instant. Birth removes us from our watery surrounds, but our final oral transition happens hours later. The fatty vernix that swaddles us at birth lingers in the ear canal, muffling airborne sound for a few minutes, or for some, for days. Soft tissues and fluid likewise recede over hours from the bones of the middle ear. When these vestiges of our fetal selves finally dissolve, our ear canals and middle ears are filled with the dry air that is our inheritance as terrestrial mammals. Yet, even in adulthood, the hair cells of our inner ears are bathed in fluid. We keep a memory of the primal ocean and the womb inside the coils of our inner ears. The rest of the ear's apparatus, the pinnae, the inner middle ear chamber, and the bones, deliver sound to this watery core. There, deep inside, we listen as aquatic beings. So what I'm trying to do in those introductory paragraphs is to take things that are familiar, like the experience of hearing, and not so familiar since we're only all just born once, and some of us give birth once or a few times, But we think about birth all the time, but often not in a evolutionary context, or what the experience of that little baby being born, moving from the aquatic medium into a terrestrial medium, is essentially recapitulating what evolution took 400 million years to do, which is to turn fish into terrestrial mammals. Well, maybe not, it took less than 400 million years ago, but the transition started at around that time. So millions of years of evolution, boom, in an instant. And then to get to the key point that I then developed later in this chapter and others, that the inner ear is still an aquatic medium. And essentially the mammalian inner ear, as many of you probably know, is an elaboration of a fish inner ear. And frogs and birds and turtles all have their own versions of that. But essentially, we're all just, these terrestrial vertebrates are all fish wandering along on land. And we still have that salt water in our inner ears, where the tiny little ciliary hairs wave around and pick up the sound and convert it into nerve signals that our brain then interprets. There's a unity there. Because insects, if you look at that, when they're hearing in the joints of their legs or in the little tympanal sort of eardrums on their legs or in their antennae, there are ciliary hairs there as well. So, or when a squid is feeling low frequency sounds through statocysts buried deep sort of behind the head, that's also involving ciliary hairs. So these little hairs connect the experience of hearing across the animal kingdom in a really in an amazing and often hidden way. Of course, the particularities of how sound waves in water or air or in solid matter are perceived and changed into neural signals, of course, there's a huge diversity there. And that's the beauty of biology. Unity and diversity together produce the great diversity of life that we have on the planet. So this is a scheme that I encourage you to do in your own communication, and that is to change the time scale and to help people think about everyday occurrences in at different time scales. Like you hear a bird song. Well, when did birds first evolve to sing? When did they first appear? And weirdly, the first birds on this planet, as far as we know, for tens of millions of years, didn't have a syrinx. So you could, in a lot of the Cretaceous, you could be in a bird-filled environment, but they weren't singing the way modern birds do. The syrinx appeared maybe 90 million years ago, maybe a little earlier than that. And just by the accident of the end Cretaceous extinction wiping out most of the non-syrinx birds, we have bird song today because of those happy accidents from millions of years ago. So we accept bird song as just this thing that we experience. But if you get in your time travel machine, it's very different. We get new insights. Okay, so this chapter continues then with a total scene shift. And this is another really key thing with writing, particularly these days, is that most people have short attention spans. Add section breaks where it's not just a break in a paragraph, but a physical break in the text itself. So my camera does not want to focus on it. Wow. Okay, my camera really doesn't want to read anything. So a section break is a longer paragraph break and often begins with some little ornamentation at the beginning. And this is like in a movie where the camera angle or the scene or the characters shift. And if you watch movies or Netflix specials, you'll see we never get more than 2 or 3 seconds from any one angle. They keep it moving to keep our interest going. So here we're going to move from the grand questions about what it means to be born in this earth as a terrestrial mammal into something a lot more specific, a particular place and time. I lie belly down on the wooden dock. The splintery boards toast me with the stored heat of the summertime Georgia sun. In my nose, the sulfurous, ripe aroma of salt marsh. The flowing water under the dock is turbid, a mud soup sweeping past on a falling tide. I'm on St. Catherine's Island, a barrier island whose eastern shores face the Atlantic. Here on the western edge of the island, 10 kilometers of salt marsh separate me from the flood-prone piney woods of the mainland. In the humid air, these woods are a mere haze on the horizon. Salt marsh grasses, interrupted by narrow, twisting tidal creeks, cover the intervening distance. These grasses grow knee or waist high among the mudflats, as thickly packed and as deep green as lush fields of young wheat. The marshes seem monotone, their uniform verdure spiced only by snowy egrets stalking the creek edges and pumping wing beats or the pumping wing beats of glossy ibises passing overhead. But these are the most productive habitats known on Earth, capturing and turning into plant material more sunlight per hectare than the lushest of forests. Grasses, algae, plankton thrive in the happy confluence of fertile mud and strong sun. This supports a diverse animal community, especially of fish. More than 75 fish species live in these tidal marshes, and ocean-dwelling fish also swim here to spawn. Their larvae grow in the protection and plenty of the marshes, then catch a ride to adulthood on an outbound tide. For all terrestrial vertebrate animals, rich salt water was our original home. First as single-celled creatures, then as fish, about 90% of our ancestry was underwater. I clamp headphones over my ears and drop a hydrophone from the dock. I'm taking my ears back to where they came from. The heavy metal capsule, a waterproof rubber and metal ball containing a microphone, sinks quickly, pulling the cable after it. I wedge a cable loop under my knee, holding the hydrophone above the creek's muddy bottom, about 3 meters down in the opaque water. When I first release the hydrophone, all I hear is the high gurgle of streaming water. As it descends, the swirling sounds fall away. Suddenly, I'm plunged into a pan of sizzling bacon fat. Sparkles surround me, a sonic shimmer. Every glistening fragment is a fleck of sunlit copper, warm and flashing. I've arrived in the acoustic domain of snapping shrimp. So here I'm giving a multi-sensory description of a particular place, the smell of the mud, what it looks like as the birds are flying over the salt marshes, and then quickly pointing out that these salt marshes may look kind of plain and fairly boring, but they're super, super productive. And now we're going to hear that productivity by listening with a hydrophone. And as many of you know, listening with a hydrophone is very cool. It reveals all kinds of sounds that even if you're right above the water, you can't hear because they're reflected back from the water surface as the sounds in the water come upward. But more than that, listening with a hydrophone really is an atavistic experience. It's taking us back to what it means to be an aquatic organism. And then I describe the sound that is common across many tropical and subtropical waters all around the world, and that is the sounds of snapping shrimp. Most people have no clue what a snapping shrimp sounds like, so I'm really reaching into the writer's bag to try and make that come alive for people. So I'm hearing, the first thing I say is gurgling. Well, the verb gurgle is onomatopoeic. In other words, the sound of the word replicates the sound of the process, gurgle, right? The G's and the U's actually sound like a hydrophone going down through the water. Then I use a metaphor. I'm plunged into a pan of sizzling bacon fat. That is basically an analogy. I'm not literally being plunged into bacon fat, but to me, snapping shrimp sound exactly what sizzling bacon in a pan sound like. And a lot of people are familiar with that sound. So hopefully it helps draw their imagination into this experience. Then I say, sparkles surround me, a sonic shimmer. There are 4 or 5 S's in that sentence. Normally you'd never do that because it just feels weird. But here I want the sentence to sound like snapping shrimp. Sparkles surround me, a sonic shimmer. And I describe them as flecks of copper, which is how it feels to me. So I'm bringing in from multiple angles an invitation for people to hear the snapping shrimp with me. And that's what, and when we're writing about things that are alien, we've got to bring out those multiple angles, metaphor, onomatopoeia, and using words in language to draw people into that experience. And just to sort of remind you all, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. Okay, there's the introductory slide, some of my books. But here are the sounds of snapping shrimp. And when I'm giving public lectures, I'll share these. This is the dock that I recorded them from in Georgia. Okay, and then I also shared this sound, which is recorded from exactly the same dock. So there we've got a little bit of foreshadowing, because later in the book I talk about the problems of noise in the oceans. And to actually have the experience of hearing that was just one very small outboard engine, what it does in terms of smothering the sounds of other creatures. And I don't know if you noticed, there was some grunting in the background there. Those are oyster toadfish hanging out there on the bottom of the mud. And when the outboard engine starts up, the snapping shrimp keep going, but the fish, there are toadfish, there are silver perch and other things there. They all go very silent very, very quickly. So the rest of the chapter, I talk about what this experience of underwater hearing means about the listening experience of different parts of the animal kingdom, what it's like to listen as a human compared to a shrimp, compared maybe to a bacterium, the sensitive to vibrations in the fluid around it, to get this sense of kinship and difference going. So, and that goes on for a couple of chapters, getting into some of the biological details. But in each case, it is really easy to get bogged down in the abstractions, like, oh, vertebrate evolution, and let's go back in time. As writers, we really have to ground those in specific examples. This dock in this place with this hydrophone, and here was my experience, because people respond really well to those stories. It's almost like a little bit of travel writing. We get to experience what the writer was feeling at that moment. And that's why we read books often. It's not just to get ideas, it's to tap into other people's experience, particularly if they're a little bit weird or cool. And as scientists, we get to do weird, cool stuff like all the time. And often it just seems normal to us. But for most people, it isn't, like going and collecting salamanders in a bucket and tagging them and so on. That's crazy interesting stuff if you can tell the story well. Okay, so then the book transitions to talk a little bit about the origins of communicative sound on this planet. And the weird thing about, of course, since the planet has got going, there have been sounds of earthquakes and volcanoes and wind, and then when it cooled down enough, water and rain and so on. But communicative sound, by which I mean a sound that evolved with the idea of communicating some signal from one organism to another, was really late arrival, as far as we can tell, on planet Earth, which is kind of a bit of a mystery, because there was chemical and visual communication right from 600 or more million years ago, whereas sonic communication, the fossil evidence for sound making devices, is much more recent. So I'll read, this is just 3 short paragraphs from a different part of the book that introduces the origin of communicative sound on Earth, a story that most people, it took me a bit of digging to find this, even as someone who's studied sound in a scientific context for a while. So grasshoppers clatter away from me as I walk the verge of a country road. Crickets chirp from hiding places in the unkempt thatch of grass. A fritillary butterfly wings pass. Every minute or two, I pass through a thin cloud of midges, and I wave my hands to sweep away their mote-like bodies. The cicadas, loud and persistent yesterday afternoon, give only sporadic croaks and stuttering whines in the cool morning. On the side of the road, exposed rock, the color of raw liver, angles up from the valley slope. Entombed within this stone are the ancestors of the insects that fly and sing around me. One of this fossilized swarm bears the earliest known sound-making structure of any animal, a ridge on the wing of an ancient cricket-like animal. This fossil is the oldest direct physical evidence of sonic communication. There should be a shrine here, a monument to honor the first known earthly voice, but pilgrimages instead lead away from these mountains in southern France to the chapels and cathedrals of the lowlands. The Camino de Santiago passes by. Pilgrims tread the road, unaware that the deepest root of all song and speech lies in the stones underneath their feet. So let me share a slide here to show you the fossil that I'm referring to. This fossil is called Permostridulus. And Olivier Betu and his colleagues at Natural History Museum in Paris were the ones who described this fossil in European Journal of Entomology. The citation is there. Here's one of their drawings, and you can see there's a raised ridge on the wing here, circled in red. Quite small, right? It's just a few millimeters long. But this ridge looks very much like the ridges with little bumps on them along the wings of katydids and modern crickets. This fossil is not a katydid or cricket. It belongs to a branch of the insect family tree that is now extinct. If we zoom in, you can see that raised ridge, and there's no function known for this ridge other than as a potential sound-making device. It's been interpreted as a sound-making device. So what I did was take measurements of the bump, the length of this, the spacing between those bumps, and then compared them to modern crickets and katydids that have different lengths of sound-making files on their wings, and they have different spacings. This one, the spacing is generally a lot more widely spaced than most modern species. And then essentially I tried to reconstruct what this creature might have sounded like when it rubbed its wings together. This, I should point out, is a speculative reconstruction based on some assumptions about allometry and things like that. The closest living analog actually is mole cricket. Mole crickets have fairly widely spaced teeth on their wings. So I'll just play this sample for you. So it almost sounds like a frog, right? I mean, it's very sort of rough, and that roughness comes from the unevenness of the spacing along the ring wedge. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because we live on a sonic planet, and this is one of the first known examples of sound-making devices anywhere in the world. So it's worthy in its own right. It begs the question, why did it take so late for this to evolve? This is 275 million years ago, roughly, this fossil is from. That is shortly after insects first evolved wings at about 300 million years ago. Before that, on all the terrestrial animals and also in the oceans on trilobites and things, there is no known sound-making device. So it was pretty late. Why? Well, maybe because making sound was actually quite dangerous. All these predators had pretty good, early predators in the oceans and on land had pretty good sense of hearing. So until you had wings and the ability to get away from creatures, from predators, sound making was maybe too costly. Maybe the same was true in the oceans. The story in the oceans is a little harder to discern. Wings, of course, are also papery structures attached to vibratory muscles, essentially little loudspeakers. So that also helped in the evolution of sound making. What happened after Permostridulus evolved in the tens of millions of years, so this is in the Permian, and then the Permian through the Triassic, we have the appearance of other crickets and katydids, a lot more evolution of, and some really beautifully preserved fossils of sound-making devices on wings. So the insects were the first, the cricket-like insects were the first sound-making creatures on land as far as we know. In the oceans, maybe it was a sturgeon and sturgeon-like ancestors that made some of the first sounds. Spiny lobsters that make sounds by rubbing their antennae down little grooves on basically on their heads. Perhaps the phylogeny suggests that they were some of the most the earliest invertebrate communicators. But the sound making in the ocean didn't really explode until about 150 million years ago. So the other thing this does is I think it reframes our experience of listening to insects in the modern day. These are crickets just recorded down the road from where I am now in Tennessee in the fall. Okay, so those are just slowed down a little bit because, as you can see, a lot of those insect sounds are up there way above 10 kilohertz. I basically can't hear anything over 7, so I like to hear things slowed down. And when we're hearing these insect choruses, in a way, we're transported back to the earliest days of communicative sound making on Earth, back into the late Permian, early Triassic, and those sounds are still with us. And it's very rare that we get an experience of deep time that comes directly to our senses in that way. Like the smell of ginkgos is maybe another sensory connection to deep time. But with sound, when we hear the insects, and in many parts of the world, it's a late summer. At least in the temperate world, it's a late summer and the beginning of the autumn when the chorus is the highest. Of course, in the subtropics and tropics, things go year round with their own seasons. So this story I try to claim in the book matters for its own sake. It reframes our experience of listening to insects. And it also is important in understanding our own hearing and vocal communication, because these insects and these sound-making insects were the context in which mammalian hearing evolved. When the first vertebrates came onto land, they had pretty horrible hearing in air. And then suddenly the world was filled with these chirping protein snacks. So there was presumably an amazing natural selection to be able to hear these singing insects, to be able to then go eat them. And it's no coincidence that right after the evolution of all these crickets and katydids, mammalian hearing in air really takes off. The middle ear bones, the coils of the inner ear all start to get more elaborate, and high frequency hearing becomes the thing that mammals, and then but also other terrestrial vertebrate lineages can do. And then, of course, that means we communicate with one another using those frequencies. So when I'm speaking now, in a way, the fact that I'm speaking at 1 to 3 kilohertz, maybe, I don't know exactly where I'm pitching it right now, somewhere around 1, is probably partly thanks to these ancient insects that encouraged mammalian hearing to get into the higher ranges, because the first vertebrates on land didn't have that ability to hear high frequencies in air. They could hear stuff in water, and through bone conduction, they could get stuff up into their inner ears, but not through the outer ear canal. So trying to give a little bit of a story of the evolution of vocal sonic communication in deep time is what I've tried to reconstruct in the book. And then the book transitions to talk a little bit about how those sounds got so diverse. And I won't share a reading from that, but there are 5 short chapters on things like vocal learning, the effects of biogeography, acoustic competition in very crowded acoustic habitats, the effects of sound transmission qualities of the air and of water and of wood that cause diversification. Because a great mystery with sound production is, why do all these species sound different from one another? Sexual selection, of course, is one of those reasons, but there are a whole range of reasons why sounds have diversified. And I want to share that with readers so that when they go outside and hear, oh, a song sparrow sounds different from a crow, or the fish crow sounds different from an American crow, people are igniting their curiosity and thinking, why? It's just the world. Often we just accept the world as it is. And of course, scientists like to ask the why and the how questions. And that's what I tried to get through particular examples that I share through the book. So After I discuss the origins and diversifications of sound in the world, I talk a little bit about human music and where human music fits into the big picture of things. And I'll share a very short reading here and then give some context. Because one of the hopes for the book is to get people who are tuned into the musical world, composers, musicians, music lovers, to think about human music and language in a broader context as part of the diversity of sound on this planet that shares ecological and evolutionary roots with other creatures, rather than thinking about everything that humans do as totally separate, which is, I think, just a Darwinian impossibility and fallacy. So here we are in going to southern Germany, to some Paleolithic caves. 40,000 years ago, in Ice Age caves in what is now southern Germany, a new kind of sound was born. The sound was simple, just a string of whistled notes, seemingly unremarkable compared to the complexity and range of birds and insects that sang outside the caves. Yet the sound was revolutionary. In the moment of its creation, Earth's generative powers leapt forward, powered by cultural evolution. Listen, primate lips blow into shaped bird bones and mammoth tusks. A chimera emerges. Hunter's breath animates the skeletons of prey. The air vibrates with the melodies and timbres from a source previously unknown anywhere on Earth, musical instruments. And the instruments that I'm talking about here are the first known instruments anywhere on the planet. And here's a slide of one of them from Nick Conard and his colleagues' paper in Nature. And I visited with them and the cave from which these are bird wing bone flutes made from griffon vulture wing bones that are carved to exactly fit the human hand. And these caves also had the first known three-dimensional figurative art. Mammoths and horses, really beautiful sculptures made out of mammoth ivory. These are made out of bird wing bones. And these are from about 42,000 years ago from these caves that are some of the first known anatomically modern humans to arrive in Europe. And to understand what those sounds might have been like, I commissioned Wolf Hein and Anna Potankowski, who Wolf Hein is an expert at recreating Paleolithic artifacts for museums and for experimental studies. Anna Fredrika Potankowski is a flute player who plays both modern but also ancient instruments. And this flute is new, but is made actually from mammoth ivory, using the same techniques and tools that people would have used back in the Paleolithic. And here's what it sounds like when Anna Potankowski plays it. This is a little sound sample she shared. So that's the sort of haunting sound. You can imagine the first people who made that sound come out. I mean, remember, the human breath is understood as being sacred in most religious traditions. And when you put that breath into the bones of an animal that you've killed, there's some like serious magic going on there. By magic, I mean convergence of things that produce strange effects in the human mind. And music does that to the present day, right? We hear music and we get emotional, and we connect to one another, and our memories come up, and we fall in love, and we mourn people. We use music at some of the most significant points in our lives to this day. And all of that music has a material and ecological origin. When we hear a violin, we're hearing, like a Stradivarius, we're hearing a pre-industrial forest, because the wood that a Stradivarius violin is made from grew from trees that predate the age of oil and gas and so on. When we hear a piano or a clarinet, we're hearing the second voice of the forest. Even an electronic keyboard, we're hearing plastic that got made from oil in the Gulf of Mexico, which is essentially ancient algae, plugged into like a nuclear power station, which is uranium or hydro or burning ancient forests and coal. So the experience of music is deeply ecological. In fact, it's one of the most intimate connections of transcendent experience, getting out of the human, merging our bodies with the bodies of other species to produce beauty and art. And I want people to go to concert halls and rock concerts and bluegrass shows and to be thinking about the forest and the ecology and that amazing trans-species merger that is happening. When the music emerges, of course, it happens in a context. This is a couple of photos of the caves, the cave entrance, and then inside the cave itself. And of course, as you all know, caves have a particular reverberance. These are clappings and finger snappings inside and outside the cave to hear the reverb. So I hope you can hear that the samples inside the cave are a lot more reverberant. And so the flute would have sounded amazing in this cave because it's reverberating in this space. And to this day, flutes sound great with a lot of reverb, and people often add it electronically or play them in reverberant spaces. Whereas violins sound great in 19th century concert halls. Gregorian chant sounds great in a sort of wide, stony, big cathedral building. And so the relationship between sound making, the shape of musical instruments, and the space in which those are being played is an ancient one in music that continues to this day. And it actually continues in our earbuds. When we listen with earbuds, we're creating a space where people can whisper in our ears. And no surprise, Billie Eilish sings mostly by whispering because we've created the space for that. So I want people to rethink their experience of music as a more ecological process with that sort of a dynamic of the space in which sound is made translates into the shape of the sound that the creature is making. And that, as many of you know from the ecological literature, is exactly how we think of, say, bird song evolving. Birds in reverberant forests tend to sing slower, simpler songs than birds in open habitats with they do lots of trills and so on. They can get away with stuff that would not sound good in a reverberant space. So the evolution of human music, the cultural development of human music, has followed some of the same rules that have guided the evolution of animal communication. So there's an interesting parallel. There. So let me share one last reading here, and this is from the latest section of the book about quote unquote crises in the sounds of the world. And I talk about the loss of forests, particularly tropical forests, as a form of silencing. The hellscape of noise in the oceans is another focus. And then noise in cities is another one. But again, I want to put our complaints and thoughts about urban noise into a bigger context. So I say, noise pollution is a grievance that dates from the first human cities. On clay tablets from Babylonia, in one of the earliest known written stories, we read of the gods' wrath at our din. Scholar Stephanie Daly translates cuneiform tablets from 1700 BCE. Elil, the chief god, complained that the noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over the racket. To impose quiet on people who were as noisy as a bellowing bull, the gods inflicted disease and famines. They also corrected their earlier omission and assigned a lifespan to humans, preventing endless population increase. Urban noise, by this account, brought us mortality and the yoke of disease. Perhaps urban scribes, kept awake by the voices, music, and clatter of neighbors, channeled their frustration into stories of revenge. So urban noise, of course, these days affects the communication networks of non-human animals, well-known bioacoustic studies in that realm. It also has a terrible effect on human health and well-being. In the EU, they estimated 40, 50,000 new cases of heart disease can be attributed to just noise of urban areas and industry and traffic. So this chapter develops some of those ideas and then also points out that noise can be an environmental injustice problem. That, say, where I live in Atlanta, the interstates were deliberately routed through mostly Black neighborhoods to destroy those neighborhoods and to pose all the noise of the interstates not onto the wealthy white neighborhoods, but onto Black communities. So noise as injustice is another element here. And again, as was true with the snapping shrimp and the flutes, I try and tell these somewhat abstract stories about noise and injustice and environmental policies through specific examples. I grew up in a city in Paris, in France, with a lot of noise, and so I relate some of those stories, the stories of what it's like to live in New York City, and then put those very detailed of granular accounts of particular noises, some of which have some interesting stories, personal stories tied up with them, into the bigger context of what do we do about managing noise in both in cities, but also outside cities in places like the oceans. So in terms of thinking about general conclusions, I mean, from this particular book, the idea is to open people's imagination and to offer an invitation to deeper and more curious listening out there in the world. Part of what happens when we listen is we learn that there are broken things in the world, but without realizing that, we're not going to fix them. But also, my hope is to inspire joy, that I think many of us who work in this realm take great joy in hearing the first birds of the spring or the first frogs coming out into the wetlands. This is a source of connection, of transcendence beyond the human that I think is essential and is really missing from a lot of people's lives. So one of the things we can do as we communicate bioacoustic research is to open the door to that invitation to connection and joy that then becomes a solid ground for meaningful action. So I'm going to stop talking there. I'd be delighted to take any questions or comments. And certainly if you want to, you can find me on social media or on email. I'd be happy to dialogue there as well. So thank you very much for having me here. And it's an honor to be with you all.
Oh man, David, thank you so much. And I encourage everyone to follow David on social media. He always posts like cool videos and recordings from the field with some explanation of the tree hopper vibrations he's recording or the sounds of different, I don't know, trees swaying in the wind, or I don't know, a bunch of stuff. So we can put your socials in the chat below. We have some questions in the chat. Great. Let's go up top. A question from Aida, who's joining us from Sumatra, Indonesia. And Ida is asking, the way you read the books is very much like poetry. I really appreciate it. How long does it take to write this book that is so rich with eco-love, she says?
Well, thank you. I'm delighted that you heard some poetry in that. I mean, if there's poetry in it, it's because there's poetry in the world, and I'm just trying to translate that onto the page. I mean, this book, I basically spent a full year working on this, and then several years. I mean, I've been thinking about sound for a lot longer than a year. I mean, for decades. But the writing process itself took basically 12 months of mostly full-time work. And then there's editing and promotion and all of that. The book proposal that I wrote for this, I spent most of the summer on. So these long nonfiction books, I mean, this is like 350-page book. They're a pretty significant commitment. And in my own life, what I've done is made it, I'm not really doing much hands-on science. I'm devoting myself to writing. I'm working on a new book now about the power of flowering plants in the world that actually are strongly connected to the diversity of sound in the world as well, surprisingly. But so I'm thinking of myself as a writer, and that's my focus. For most people, that taking a whole year to write the book is not gonna work. So writing shorter pieces for magazines, opinion pieces for local newspapers, those are great ways of getting into that. I should say my first book, The Forest Unseen, I was a department chair. I was still working on EPA grants and publishing and teaching 6 courses a year. So that book took 6 years to write. And mostly in the summers when I found little bits of time. And so these are sort of longer term projects when it's a book length thing.
Mm. So next we have a question from Russ. And so your writing is so rich, evocative, and multi-layered. Did you ever have any formal training as a writer, or have you developed your skills more independently?
Yeah, no, well, I came through the French and the UK education system where they track you really quickly, and I was doing all science. So my formal education as of a writer is just reading a lot. So I read just a lot of books, but not to train myself, but for pleasure. I just want to read some cool fiction stories to just get out of the disaster that is the world, the news cycle, and so on. I love that as a form of escapism. I read a lot of biologically oriented books, stuff like, in grad school, things like E.O. Wilson's books, but also Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She's not a biologist, but she writes a lot about insects and frogs, and brings a very sort of poetic ear to all of that. Ironically, now I teach nonfiction writing to students at the college here, and rather than courses that are strictly biology. So writing is one of those art forms that I think, unlike, say, if you're going to learn the violin really well, you really need to start early and work at it with a teacher. Writing, we're all writers, right? I mean, writing is just sound of a voice crystallized temporarily onto the page. So it's a much more accessible art form to get into, and there are lots of different ways of finding the voice. But no, just the way I learned was by doing it, and doing a lot of reading.
One question. So we currently have a bioacoustics class here. I think all of us are involved in some way with bioacoustics research, and some of that involves a field component. And I was wondering, like, how much importance do you find in like going to the places where these phenomena are occurring, versus, doing online research and listening to the sounds at the
Yeah.
lab? And then when you're in the field, do you have a notebook with you where you're jotting down thoughts and observations, or do you feel like you can bottle them up and then when you get back to your office, days later, a week later,
Mhm.
you're able to sort of recall that experience
Yeah.
back? I'm curious for your
Yeah,
process.
I would say all of the above. I mean, in my teaching, I spend a lot of time taking students outside so they can actually develop listening abilities and so on. In my own work, I have a notebook where, because I can't rely just on memory, I'm going to forget most stuff, and memory, of course, is unreliable. So I do have a notebook where I'm writing down just details, times and dates, and what I heard, and some of it is about sound, but some is just other things going on. I usually have these days I have a little Zoom H1N recorder, super portable, just in my backpack at all times, so I can record things. I mean, it's not the highest quality audio, but it's pretty darn good actually, for interesting sounds that will then jog my memory later, but also give me the renewed sonic experience so I can really hear it and describe it. Because when I'm describing sounds, I really want to get to feel it in my chest and feel the emotions coming up, and all of that. So writing is a kind of embodied experience for that. Yes, I really try and go to the field sites and listen a lot. The one exception was I was meant to go to Borneo to work, to visit some of the sites there that Susanna Buri-Valova has worked with, Eddie Game, other people using remote recording devices out in the forest, them and some other folks. But then COVID came along. It's like, okay, I'm not I'm not going to Borneo. I'm not going to the next town over, let alone across the world. And so I spend a lot of time listening to their rainforest recordings in a suburban, very kind of sterile environment in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado. And actually, in the book, I wrote about that dissociation of listening to one environment when you're located in another, which of course is great for doing scientific analysis, but it produces a kind of a divide that if I find that if I really go into those sounds deeply, it's almost like a seasickness because the humidity isn't right and the taste of the air. I mean, you know how it is to be in the forest is a totally immersive experience. And if we only take our ears there, woo, we really uh, we at least I have this sense of things being pulled apart in my body. It's also delightful, of course, because you get to in the middle of lockdown to be immersed in some of the most rich acoustic habitats in the world. So um, and so at first I was like, okay, this is a problem, but then I realized, no, I'm going to write about this process because for most of us, our experience of sound is almost 100%, not 100%, but a lot of our experience of sound is recorded, whether it's recorded music coming on Spotify or on our CD player, recordings that we're using in our research. And that is a weird thing. I mean, sound recording didn't exist till the late 1800s. And we can now dissociate the experience of music from being with the musicians. What does that mean? I don't think it's necessarily all bad, but I do think it's worth thinking about.
Mhm.
There's a question here about fossil evidence of stuff in the oceans, and could the first communicative sounds evolve in the ocean? Absolutely. I'm hoping some cool trilobite expert will discover some stridulatory device on a trilobite. Fish phylogeny suggests that sturgeon that make sounds now may have been some of the earliest communicators, maybe like 400 or more million years ago. Most sound making fish now, my understanding of the latest phylogenies, most of the current taxa have evolved in the last 100, 150 million years. Before that, it's kind of hard, like when mussels are rubbing on swim bladders, that doesn't leave a lot of signal in the fossil record. So one hope actually for the book is it stimulates people's curiosity to say there's no way that there was no sonic communication in the ocean back 400 million years ago. I'm going to go and disprove this guy, Haskell, and that, that would delight me. So people who are experts in fish phylogenies or fish fossil records or trilobites and stuff, yeah, I'm because it was actually amazing to me, and I emailed a lot of people in a lot of museums about fossil records, and all of them were like, no, we don't know of any of that evidence. It doesn't mean it's there, it just means it's not. Whereas if you ask when did the first compound eye evolve, yeah, you can get an answer to that in 5 seconds on Google Scholar.
Hmm. Let's see. We've got a few more questions left if you're able to stay
Oh, yeah.
more minutes with us. All right, great. So Onesi is, if you scroll up, you could see his question. I think two questions related to crickets. One has to do with just the diversity of cricket sounds, and then the other is, do you know if these crickets and locusts are able to listen to the sounds of other animal species and I don't know, and does their behavior change based on um, perceiving these sounds?
Yeah, so I'm not seeing the questions here in my Q&A, but so in terms of cricket diversification of sounds, there's some evidence that they're spreading out sort of Bernie Krause style to not overlap with one another, although the evidence for birds is actually the other way, at least in the Amazon, that birds are actually overlapping more than you'd expect by chance. So that's a whole very interesting question. In terms of hearing one another, it really depends where you are. So there's some pretty good neurobiology evidence that in extremely acoustically crowded environments, the sensitivity of the insects' hearing organs is extremely narrow and just tuned to their own species sound. So they're not basically picking up the sounds of other creatures. Whereas in environments where there are fewer crickets, say temperate meadows where there aren't hundreds of crickets all singing at the same time, or hundreds of cricket species, there's much wider tuning, and so they absolutely would be able to hear one another. So the evolutionary context varies quite a bit for that. And I think with frogs, actually, there's some biological evidence the same thing about the crowdedness of the environment. Doesn't so much change the sound, it changes the tuning of the ear. I'm pointing to my ears, but of course crickets aren't hearing with these. But it changes the tuning of nerves and of the organs that are connected into the nerves to allow more precision of hearing. The other part of that is hearing predators. Because if there's a wasp coming to parasitize you, and so you got to be able to hear that as well.
Mhm.
And so different species have different ways of dealing with that. Some frogs have one part of their ear basically tuned to their own species sound, and then the other is more of a broad spectrum thing. I want to hear when the owl is coming to get me.
Hmm. Looks like we've got three questions left. Ashik, who you may know, he works with us at the Yang Center, and he's asking, as a non-native English speaker, a lot of the richness of materials written in English are lost. So what's your approach of making artistic aspects of your writing more accessible to non-native English speakers? For example, the sizzling bacon reference would have been lost on Ashik before he came to the US. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Of course, all writing happens within a particular cultural context, and I'm writing in the English language. And I'd say the vast majority of the connection beyond the English language is happening through the work of translators. So the people who translated my work into Italian and Chinese are finding the analogies, finding the right verbs and the connections to make that work. And of course, that work is, as I would argue, as hard, as difficult as the work of writing the book in the first place, right? Because it's not just like a Google Translate thing where you just substitute one word for another. No, there's the meaning and the emotion that is associated with that. And my and analogies like bacon fat. I mean, I mostly don't eat meat, but I've occasionally heard bacon fat cooking, and so that's one that I'm looking for analogies that are going to work for most of the readers. And by necessity, that those choices, by focusing on a particular analogy, you're going to exclude other people. And I try not to do that, but I absolutely am imperfect and unable to to do that all the time. I remember when I first came to the US, I was taking actually at Cornell a class on statistics. And there were all these examples from American sports, like shooting hoops. I had no idea what shooting hoops was. I mean, I guess it's something to do with basketball. I mean, I've been here 35 years now, and I still don't really know what shooting hoops is. But, and so that was another example where, I tried to, and again, I'm not saying I'm particularly good at this, but try to remember that my own experience of, I grew up in a country where I didn't speak the language. I grew up in France from English parents and so on, trying to make sure those connections are open, but also by necessity, language, particularly when you get into the precise meanings of verbs and the emotional overtones that come with verbs. Like if I'm going to walk across the room versus strut or saunter or shuffle or shimmy, those all have very different emotional associations with them. But you've got to know the language quite well to get that. But hopefully, if you don't know the language well, you can still get some of the meaning there, and the same with analogies. So finding things that are going to make those connections is helpful. And most of my analogies are to processes like hitting balls and the sounds of the human body and things that I hope are fairly universal. The other important part of this, of course, is that this is a book about sound. And of course, we all differ in our ability to hear, right? And there's a deaf community where, say, the inner ear is not working the way that it does in many other people. And yet there's a rich gestural language and an ability and an honoring of hearing through fingertips and through sounds in the body. And I address that a little bit in this book. But of course, a book about sound is in a way excluding the experience of people who can't say hear crickets. And when I go out with my students, they hear a lot of things that I can't hear because I don't have hearing above about 7 kilohertz. And I use some technologies to sort of help with that. But that's another aspect of inclusion and exclusion that I'm aware of. And you know, it's a problem. A book about a particular sense needs to address that head on. And I hopefully I put it in an evolutionary context there, because none of us hear the bats or the rats or the mice. So we all hear within a restricted range. It's not like there are some people who have hearing and some people who don't. That's just not true. Yeah. So thank you for that question. Really important.
Great. Yeah. And great answer too. So we've got two more questions to close us out. Russ um, asks, I think from his great wealth of experience working with um, audio analysis, just how much bioacousticians rely on visual representations of sound, like
Right.
spectrograms. So he is asking you, maybe grilling you. No, just kidding. Can you talk a bit about your decision not to show any spectrograms in the book and not really cover how much bioacoustic science relies on visual representations of sound?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I use spectrograms all the time, and I just taught a lab, yeah, last night about getting students to do to use them and interpret them. So none of my books have illustrations. So I'm trying to let words do the work here. The problem with, okay, the beauty of spectrograms is, of course, we can see things with our eyes that our ears maybe can't pick up. And we can also use spectrograms for quantitative analysis, like actually taking measurements to answer real, like data-driven questions. The problem with spectrograms is that we are primarily visual culture and visual creatures. And so if I have a lot of them in the book, the spectrograms then like basically take over a lot of the space there. And what I want to do is evoke the sounds literally in people's brains. And whenever we write, we actually, say if I'm reading silently, the listening portion of my brain actually activates a little bit. So reading text, like just text on a page, is actually an act of listening. And when I'm describing in that text sounds, I want those sounds to actually to exist in the conscious subjective experience of readers. And people who are good at reading spectrograms can do that, right? So if we look at like a really broad spectrogram, we can say that's a hissing sound or a whistle that goes up and then has a trill and so on. But it takes a little while to actually kind of to read that. And other people have done great work with this. A lot of other good sound books out there that use spectrograms and apps, Merlin app, and so on. A lot of people are getting a lot more familiar with actually reading spectrograms. And I use a Merlin app to listen to birds that I can't hear, right? Because I can see them on the screen. In terms of discussing it, yeah, I mean that's, if I were to re-edit the book in the places where I'm talking about, say, passive acoustic monitoring and stuff like that, talk about the importance of spectrograms, I think would be appropriate there. So, that is one deficiency in the book. I do think, I'd be interested in your take in this, is that whether like automated stuff that is looking at, say, soundscape saturation and the million different ways of measuring soundscape characteristics or extracting detections of particular organisms, whether that in a way is meaning that we're looking at fewer spectrograms now because we're asking the computer to do a lot of that looking for us, because the computer, of course, it's not using its eyes, but it's using our algorithms and so on to pull out that information. So yeah, that's really important. And actually in my teaching, what I do is students make lots of spectrograms. I also ask them to produce multiple visual representations of sound, like each student studies a particular place on campus through the semester and records the sound and analyzes it. But then I make them do drawings, paintings, little symbolic things, to get into a different way of hearing the sound and then representing it as a visual experience. So that, which there's a quantitative way, but then there's also a way that is more artistic, if you like. And I think they work together, and particularly for undergraduate education, where the key is to activate as many parts of the brain and put them into connection with one another. But yeah, great question.
Wow. Yeah, I you just gave me some ideas for our course. And with the note that maybe we're looking or using spectrograms less as we develop more automated techniques, a lot of these neural networks like BirdNet, what they do, the first thing they do is convert the sound into a spectrogram. And so these machines that are
Mhm.
learning, they're also learning from visual representations of
Right.
sound
Interesting.
for,
Yep.
yeah. And then, okay, let's do one last question from an anonymous attendee. Is it true that early human movement was tied to bird song, and thus the frequency range of our hearing largely overlaps with the frequency of bird song? Have you heard anything about that?
No, I would say, well, so first thing, our hearing doesn't just overlap, it actually goes much wider. I mean, depending on, mine doesn't. For the people with the maximal hearing range actually hear much higher frequencies than many birds can hear. So weirdly, bird uh, frequency detection drops off pretty sharply after 10 kilohertz, which is odd because a lot of them are actually vocalizing pretty close up to that threshold. So humans can actually hear higher frequencies than many birds can. There are some birds like pigeons and others that can hear what we would call infrasound, so lower frequency sounds. So there is a huge overlap, but there are also some areas where they can hear lower and we can hear a lot higher. In terms of human movement and birdsong, I had not heard that. The data from, it's not about humans, but about early mammals, is that there's a very tight correlation. And I think this was a paper in Proceedings of the National Academy last year or the year before. A pretty tight correlation between the evolution of katydid song and high frequency mammalian hearing. So we owe our high frequency hearing not so much to birds that weren't vocalizing back, because birds hadn't evolved back in the Triassic. We owe the katydids, or bush crickets as they're known outside of North America, we owe our high frequency hearing perhaps to them, to even, maybe even a sort of loose co-evolutionary process. But certainly bird song in terms of cultural evolution is massively important. The number of places in which bird song plays an important part in poetry, in sacred scripture, in tying our cultural festivals to the seasons and to changes over time. I mean, think about Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. The whole title is about the loss of bird song, even though most of the book is not about birds. I mean, there are birds in it, but so birdsong is extremely central for our understanding of ourselves and our relation to the world.
Okay, as we wrap up, one last question, and that is, what is the best way for folks in countries outside the US to access your book? Is there an ebook available, or is
Yeah.
this, let's say, from Indonesia to, I don't know, Cameroon, or how can
Yeah.
people access your work?
So the book is out in Penguin paperback, and it should be available for book vendors. And I realize in different countries, access to paperback books published in the US varies. There is an ebook version. Penguin Random House has done an ebook that goes with it, also an audio book that comes with it. So depending on the exact market, I mean, I know in some countries, the US book market is actually barred from selling into those countries. The book publishing world is kind of a mess. I mean, same thing with the UK. There are separate copyright rules and so on. But looking for, and particularly because it's out in paperback, the used book vendors also often have a good number of copies of the books. And certainly my early books, like The Forest Unseen, is widely available from in used form, which means it's easier to, I mean, it's cheaper, but also easier to export and so on. But all the electronic platforms, if you have access to like Kobo, Kindle, other ebook readers, it should be there.
That's great. Okay, well, David, yeah, thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you.
and
Thank you for having me.
your thoughts and sharing your work. And yeah, it's just incredibly interesting. And so yeah, thank you and hope we can stay connected and inspired by your ideas. In 2 weeks, we're gonna take a different tack with Nilo Ricaldi, who studies evolution of birdsong, especially in this population of great tits. I think he did this large scale analysis of several million calls and understood the factors that were contributing to dialects across these different across this site. Is an incredible study. So we're going to be lucky to have him join us in 2 weeks. And yeah, look forward to seeing you then. So thanks everyone for tuning in and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
So long.